of all, let's begin with a confession that the category of wisdom literature is pretty arbitrary. I mean, think about it. You first of all have Job, which is a long-running narrative, but mainly is completely composed of dialogue. And you have Proverbs, which are just Proverbs, a collection of stories with very little chronological sequencing to them. And then you have Ecclesiastes, which has a narrative feature, but also is very similar to Proverbs. And then the Song of Solomon, which is its own genre in and of itself that doesn't fit any other categories. And so we collect those together in what we call the wisdom literature. However, they can be approached in unique ways. Preaching the Song of Solomon, it does have a narrative feel. And so you can preach in a way that highlights this relationship between the preacher and the Shulamite maiden that delivers, that ultimately reaches some type of conclusion. It's a story of their relationship together, and it can be a template, if you will, for our relationship with Christ and the church's relationship with Christ later on. The book of Job is, in fact, dialogue. It can be preached from a macro view, taking several large chunks of Scripture and showing how ultimately Job nor his friends understood what was going on, but God had to come and right everything. And so although Job started with the right attitude, he had to be corrected and eventually brought to believe that even on his best day, he couldn't understand all that was going on inside of there. The book of Ecclesiastes is the same way. Somewhat of a narrative feel, but at the same time, it's more individual lessons that are giving over, that are reaching to an end. The most difficult one to preach, structurally perhaps, is the book of Proverbs. This is because we're talking about the structure of the text becoming the structure of the sermon. How does that happen when this collection of sayings is put together with seemingly no structure? So how do you preach through Proverbs? Let's talk about that for just a minute. Well, first of all, you can preach through them chronologically. Chapters 1 through 9 are a sequence of what it means to have true wisdom and the fear of the Lord. So preach through chapters 1 through 9, what we would call verse by verse. But then when you get to chapter 9 and following, you run into a problem, and that is these stories are just collected. How do you preach those? Well, let me give you one way to do that. What you can the way you can preach them is not so much analytically, but you can preach them topically. You say, well, you're a seminary professor, you don't talk about topical preaching. That's like for communists and atheists and things like this. Well, actually, in this way, topical preaching is good, meaning we're not borrowing some topic and trying to take it to Scripture, but we're actually extracting the topic that's already embedded there in the text. The truth of the matter is, all great expository preaching is topical preaching. It's just letting God choose the topic. So we look at the Scripture, we look at the topics that are covered in Proverbs, and we ask ourselves this question: how is it that the Proverbs answers the question about gluttony or anger or lust or whatever else it is? And then we allow those questions to come up, and we use the sermon as a way to answer those questions. So here's not the way to do it, but here's a way to do it. Try to identify the questions that the Proverbs are answering. Once you identify those questions, then answer them there with the Proverbs. A way to make this easier would be to have one representative text. In other words, have them turn in their Bibles to one particular proverb, deal with that proverb, bring in the other proverbs to show how they also answer the questions that the text is raising, and then make some connection to the New Testament corollary. So the example that I've given you in the back of the book is actually Proverbs on anger. I was asked to preach at a church, and they were doing a series through Proverbs, and I was assigned the topic of anger. And so what I did is simply ask two questions. The first one is this: what is the danger of anger? And why did I choose that question? Well, it wasn't completely arbitrary. That's what Proverbs does. It shows you all these ways in which anger is extremely dangerous. And then secondly, what is the remedy for displaced anger? And I took it to the New Testament and showed how God actually deals with this. It's actually from walking in the Spirit, not simply putting away anger, but rather being filled with the Holy Spirit. In closing, I used the illustration of Joseph, who had many opportunities to become angry, many opportunities to become resentful, but he didn't do so. He actually put his trust in God. However, and this is important, that's not why God saved Joseph. God saved Joseph ultimately because Christ would come, and later on, through the children of Israel, through keeping the children of Israel alive, Christ would come and be the ultimate remedy for our anger. So in other words, God saved Joseph so that he could save us from a life of displaced anger and from all the other things that are unvirtuous in our life. And through Christ, we have the presence of the Spirit that allows us to walk in His Spirit and not be filled with anger. Trying to connect what the Old Testament says in the book of Proverbs to its conclusion and culmination in the New Testament.